person, well qualified, deserves to be on the bench. That's the way conservatives and liberals should engage each other, in my view, when it comes to the judicial nomination process. This was a bridge too far for Lindsey Graham. I yield.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
I'd like to inquire how much time we have on our side.
4 minutes, 3 minutes and 45 seconds.
Okay. My objections to this nominee can be summarized with 5 areas of concern: his controversial writings and speeches, an activist judicial philosophy, his lack of judicial temperament, his troublesome testimony, and a lack of candor before the committee. I would hope that the President would withdraw the nominee and send up a consensus nominee. We on this side have demonstrated over and over again our cooperation in moving forward on consensus nominations. The President needs to nominate a mainstream individual who understands the proper role of a judge. Nominees who would bring a personal agenda and political ideology to the courtroom will have great difficulty in being confirmed. I have troubles with a statement that's been made that the Court of Appeals is where law is made, and we need the finest minds in the world for that. First, intellect is an important element that we ought to consider in any confirmation process. This nominee has an outstanding academic record. His intellect is not the issue. The nominee himself noted there was more to being a judge than intellect, because he said this in regard to Chief Justice Roberts' nomination, quote, "There's no doubt Roberts has a brilliant legal mind, but a Supreme Court nominee must be evaluated on more than legal intellect." That's the end of the quote. He then voiced concern that with remarkable consistency throughout his career, Roberts had applied his legal talent to further the cause of the far right. Mr. Lieu went on demonstrating a lack of judicial temperament to disparage Justice Roberts' view on free enterprise, private property, and limited government. In my statement yesterday, I made my views very clear on how I feel about Mr. Lieu's remarks. The point is, intellect is only one component. Using Mr. Lieu's standards, a nominee, quote, "must be evaluated on more than legal intellect," end of quote. Mr. Lieu does have a fine intellect, but he has used his talent to consistently promote views that are far out of the mainstream. Shortly after President Obama was elected, he said, quote, "Now we have the opportunity to actually get our ideas and the progressive vision of the Constitution and of the laws and the policy into practice." I will not give Mr. Lieu that opportunity. A second problem I have with the statement is the assertion that, quote, "the Court of Appeals is where law is made." We have heard this view before. While serving as a circuit judge, Justice Sotomayor stated that the Court of Appeals, quote, "is where policy is made," end of quote. Now, I understand that there are elements of our society who wish this were the case. Those who can't get their policy views enacted through the legislative process, as our Constitution requires, often turn to the courts. But I flatly reject that notion. The Constitution vests legislative power in the Congress, not the courts. Judges are simply not policymakers. Unfortunately, this philosophical disagreement occasionally finds its way into debate on nominations. But let me remind the Senate where this started. Going back to the nomination of William Rehnquist in 1971, Democrats have used or attempted to use the filibuster to delay or defeat judicial nominees. Fortunately, it is a rare occasion. There have been a total of 46 cloture votes, including this one, on 32 different judicial nominations in American history. Of the 32 judicial nominees subject to cloture vote, 22 were against Republican-nominated judges. Between 71 and the year 2000, there were 11 cloture votes on judicial nominees. Most of those filibusters attempted by Democrats were unsuccessful and cloture was invoked. However, beginning in 2002, Senate Democrats changed the rules. Yes, I ask to put the rest of my statement in the record, and I would also ask for additional statements or opportunities to put documents in the record in opposition to the nomination.
Without Senator from Vermont.
President, to begin with, I'd ask consent that my full statement be made part of the record
Without objection.
and certain attachments be made part of the record. You know, I've listened to a lot of the debate about Professor Liu, and having sat in on the hearings with him, having met with him, having gone through the whole record, I sometimes wonder who this is everybody's talking about. It's not the man I heard from, a man who, unlike speeches we can all make, a man who testified under oath and had to speak very candidly and very honestly about his positions. He's a man who's admired by legal thinkers and academic scholars from across the political spectrum. And it shows. He spent his career in public service, private practice, as a teacher since receiving degrees from Stanford University and Yale Law School. He's a Rhodes Scholar. In fact, when you look at the support, and among the letters I will put in the record, we have one from Kenneth Starr, the former Solicitor General during President George H.W. Bush's administration. He's actually also, for those who may have forgotten, the independent counsel who investigated President Clinton during the Clinton administration. He and distinguished Professor Akhil Amar wrote, "It is our privilege to speak to his qualifications and character, and to urge favorable action on his nomination. In short, Goodwin is a person of great intellect, accomplishment, integrity, exceptionally well qualified to serve on the Court of Appeals. The nation is fortunate he's willing to leave academia to engage in this important form of public service." We then heard from Clinton Bullock, who is the director of the conservative Goldwater Institute, named after a former colleague of mine, Barry Goldwater. He said, having reviewed several of his academic writings, I find Professor Liu to exhibit fresh, independent thinking and intellectual honesty. He clearly possesses the scholarly credentials and experience to serve with distinction on this important court. And I put in a number of other similar things from Republicans and Democrats across the political spectrum. After law school, he had clerked for D.C. Circuit Judge David Tatel, Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You know, don't question his intellect or his qualifications. He should be treated with respect and admired, not maligned and caricatured. His honest testimony during 2 hearings before the Judiciary Committee should be credited rather than ignored. He's the son of Taiwanese immigrants, and he would bring much-needed diversity to the federal bench. There is no Asian Pacific American judge on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which of course includes California and Hawaii, and a number of western states. In fact, rather than debate, or vote for him or vote against him, but vote. Cloture vote means you vote maybe. Most Americans tend to see to vote yes or no. And rather than that debate, an up or down vote, the Republican senators argued just a few years ago every nominee deserved. We've had to file cloture on this. You know, the senators, many of whom are still serving on the other side of the aisle, claim to subscribe to a standard that prohibits filibusters of judicial nominees, except in extraordinary circumstances. None of them have said there's an extraordinary circumstance here. They've nominated an outstanding lawyer, the President has, supported by his home state senators, favorably reported by a majority of the Senate Judiciary Committee, as for a vacancy, a judicial emergency on the Ninth Circuit. Now, we've had a lot of judicial nominees that have gone through here that I may have disagreed with, some I may even have voted against, but we've allowed an up or down vote. And we have 14 senators who signed a memorandum of understanding in 2005, the then gang of 14. They wrote about their responsibilities under the advice and consent clause. Well, let's be responsible. Let's be responsible. Let's bring it to a vote. I think of the vote on Janice Rogers Brown. She was a nominee who would argue that Social Security was unconstitutional. I think most of us disagreed with her on that, but she got an up or down vote. They had agreed to vote cloture on the nomination of Priscilla Owens. Owens, a D.C. Circuit nominee whose rulings on the Texas Supreme Court were so extreme, they drew a condemnation of other conservative judges in that court. In fact, President Bush's White House counsel and later Attorney General called one of her opinions as an unconscionable act of judicial activism, but she was a Republican and she did get a vote. Now, I had hoped 2 weeks ago when 11 Republican senators joined in voting to end a filibuster against Judge Jack McConnell of Rhode Island that the Senate was moving away from the narrow partisan attacks on judicial nominations that slowed us almost from the day President Obama took office. Indeed, for the 6th time since President Obama took office, just over a couple of years ago, we've had to seek cloture to overcome a Republican filibuster of one of President Obama's well-qualified judicial nominations. And those senators who claim to subscribe to a standard that prohibits filibusters to judicial nominees, except in extraordinary circumstances, should not be able to support this filibuster because, as I've said, there are no extraordinary circumstances here. I think of that memorandum of understanding I referred to earlier, saying how we should fulfill our responsibilities under the advice and consent clause of the United States Constitution. In that, these 14 senators wrote about the need for the President to consult with senators. Well, this President, unlike his predecessor, has been a model in that regard. Unlike President Bush, whose nominees they always supported, President Obama actually has consulted with both Republican and Democratic senators in the home states. And unlike my predecessor, the Republican chairman of the Judiciary Committee, I have not proceeded with any nominee against the wishes of a home state senator. So apparently we have one rule they're eager to adhere to if it's a Republican president and a Republican chairman of the committee. But man, oh man, nothing changes the rule faster than to have Democrats here. I protected Republican home state senators. In return, I would expect Republican senators to respect the views of other senators and to work with the President. By the standard utilized in 2005, supported by Republicans to end filibusters and vote on President Bush's controversial nominees, this filibuster should be ended. The Senate should vote on the nomination. Last year, Senate Republicans filibustered the nomination of Judge Denny Chin, an outstanding judge with 16 years' experience. They delayed his Senate consideration for months. There was no reason to do it. Finally, when that filibuster ended, the Senate proceeded to vote and confirmed the only active Asian Pacific American judge serving on the Federal Appellate Court. The only one in all our courts. Well, this nominee is likewise deserving of a vote and not have a partisan filibuster. Vote up Vote down. Don't vote maybe. That's not what we get paid for. I said when the committee held its unusual second hearing on the nomination, at the request of Republican members of the committee, a hearing that I allowed, that I hope they would evaluate him fairly with open minds. Any senator who listened to Professor Liu's answers during hours of questioning at 2 confirmation hearings and considers responses to hundreds of written follow-up questions, hundreds, should come away understanding this is an exceptional lawyer, a scholar who will make an outstanding judge, a judge who respects the rule of law and reveres the Constitution. Professor Liu's answers under oath, his reputation as a well-respected constitutional law professor, paint a very different picture than the caricature created by the attacks from special interest groups. No fair-minded person can or should question his qualifications, talent, or character. Nobody can doubt his temperament. Hours and hours of questioning. We heard a judicial temperament. And unlike some of the nominees supported by the other side, he actually answered the questions. He assured the committee time and time again he understands the role of a judge, the need for a judge to follow the law and adhere to the rule of law. He met every test presented to him by senators on the Judiciary Committee from either side of the aisle. He exceeds every standard we've used to measure judicial nominees. Now, I had concerns that a conservative activist law professor nominated by President Bush, Professor McConnell, would turn out to be a conservative activist judge on the 10th Circuit. But I put faith in Professor McConnell's assurance he understood the difference between his role as a teacher and advocate, his future role as a judge. He assured us he respected the doctrine of stare decisis, and as a federal appeals court judge, he would be bound to follow Supreme Court precedent. His home state senator, Senator Hatch, vouched for him. The similarity, except for the philosophy, is exactly the same between McConnell and Liu. We voted for McConnell. They want to stop Liu. I would hope every senator would treat Professor Liu with the same fairness that the others have, that we treated them. So give the same weight to Professor Liu's assurances that we did to Professor McConnell's identical assurances, and then vote up or down. President, how much time is remaining?
13 minutes and 30 seconds. Sir, I'm understanding that you'll have the time that you need. If he would need the rest, you're going to have your time.
Mr. President, I suggest the absence of quorum. I'm going to go.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without
I
objection.
yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Minority Leader.
over the past 2 years, our nation has been engaged in a great debate about the kind of country we want America to be, a place of maximum liberty and limited government, or a place where no problem is too big or too small for the government to get involved. This debate arose because of a president who made no apologies about wanting to move America to the left, and it continues today despite widespread opposition to the president's policies because of the president's clear determination to forge right ahead. But just as Rome wasn't built in a day, neither is President Obama's vision assured. Rather, it's a work in progress. A big part of the president's plan was to put government in charge of our nation's health care system. Another part was making sure government calls the shots over private industry and elections. So much so that we're actually having a debate right now about whether businesses need to ask the White House permission to move to another state, and whether private businesses should be forced to disclose political contributions in order to get a federal contract. And still another part of the president's vision involves the people he wants to put on our nation's courts. Do we want people who have a reverence for the U.S. Constitution and who believe it means what it says? Or do we want people on our courts who care more about advancing an ideology that's antithetical to the Constitution than they do about upholding it? This is the question presidents need to ask themselves when it comes to judicial nominees. And I think this president's preference in this area is abundantly clear. Based on some of the nominations we've seen, President Obama wants men and women on the courts who will advance his vision, who would expand the scope of government beyond anything the founders could ever have imagined. Yet not until now has the Senate been asked to confirm someone who has so openly and vigorously repudiated the widely accepted meaning and purpose of the Constitution. And here I'm referring, of course, to the nomination of Goodwin Liu to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So this afternoon I'd like to take a moment to explain why I believe it is so critically important that the Senate reject this nomination now by opposing cloture on it. The first thing I'd like to say about Mr. Liu is that I have nothing against him personally. No one disputes that he has a compelling personal story or that he's possessed of a fine intellect. But earning a lifetime appointment isn't a right, nor is it a popularity contest. Rather, it is incumbent upon those of us who are required to vote on judicial nominees like him to evaluate each one of them closely, to examine their judicial philosophies, to look at their records, and to consider their temperaments, and that's just what we've done here. What have we found? Well, when it comes to Mr. Liu's record as a practicing lawyer, the first thing to say is that it's almost non-existent. He has no prior experience as a judge and minimal experience actually practicing law. This means that in evaluating what kind of judge Mr. Liu would be and in trying to determine his judicial philosophy, we're necessarily limited to what he has written. And what do Mr. Liu's writings reveal? Put simply, they reveal a left-wing ideologue who views the role of a judge not as that of an impartial arbiter, but as someone who views the bench as a position of power. As recently as 2 years ago, Mr. Liu said he believed that the last presidential election gave liberals, as he put it, quote, a tremendous opportunity to actually get their ideas and the progressive vision of the Constitution and of law into practice, end quote. Here is an open acknowledgement by Mr. Liu that a judge should use his position to advance his own views. This is repugnant. Anyone who holds such a view as a judge would undermine the integrity of the courts. So what are Mr. Liu's views? Well, in an article he published 3 years ago, he wrote that courts should interpret the U.S. Constitution as containing a right to education, shelter, subsistence, and health care, a constitutional right. By this he meant that the court should determine how particularly welfare goods should be distributed, rather than the people themselves through the democratic process. The point here is that Mr. Liu appears to view the judge not as someone whose primary job is to interpret the Constitution, but as someone whose lifetime tenure liberates him to advance his views of what the Constitution means and empowers him to impose it on others. In his view, it is the job of a judge to create new rights, regardless of what the Constitution says or what the American people acted on during the democratic process. And while this philosophy may be popular on left-wing college campuses, it has no place whatsoever in a U.S. courtroom. Anyone who enters our courtroom should have the assurance that judges will uphold their rights equally and that they won't overstep their bounds. Mr. Liu's writings provide no such assurance. On the contrary, they suggest a deeply held commitment to the view that the Constitution can mean, pretty much whatever a judge wants it to. The judges can just sort of make it up as they go along. In his court, the defendant couldn't expect to be protected by the Constitution and the laws because the law is subject to the whim of the judge. This is precisely the opposite of what Americans expect in a judge. It also happens to be the opposite of what the founders envisioned for the courts. As it says in Federalist 78, the judiciary has neither force nor will, but merely judgment. Compare this with his writings, which suggest again and again that a judge shouldn't look so much at the words of the Constitution when setting out to interpret it as they should, quote, our collective values, end quote, or our, quote, evolving norms, end quote. Well, let's be clear. It is the judge, in his view, who will determine what norms are evolving, not the American people. Clearly, the Constitution itself would take a back seat in his court. Indeed, even a brief review of his writings suggests that as a judge, he might very well accord greater respect to foreign law than he would to our own Constitution. As he once wrote, the U.S. can hardly claim to have a monopoly on wise solutions to common legal problems faced by constitutional democracies around the world. Again, this might fly in a left-wing classroom, but it's cold comfort to those who look to the courts for equal justice under the law. Americans shouldn't have to wonder when they walk into an American courtroom which nation's law they'll be judged under. So as I see it, there's no question based on his writings that Mr. Liu's judicial philosophy is completely and totally antithetical to the judicial oath that he would be sworn to uphold. Now, upon his nomination to the bench, Professor Liu has sought to distance himself from his legal writings. He told the Judiciary Committee that he stands by them, however. Well, he can't have it both ways. And as others have pointed out, if we can't go by the things he has written, there's nothing left upon which to evaluate it. So on the question of qualifications, Professor Liu just doesn't have much legal experience outside the classroom. And while no one is saying teachers can't be good judges, this particular teacher's judicial philosophy, as evidenced by his writings, is so far outside the mainstream that anyone who believes in the primacy of the U.S. Constitution should be deeply, deeply troubled by the prospect of his appointment to the court. I believe this nominee is precisely the kind of judge we want to prevent from getting on the bench. He should not be confirmed. I will vote against cloture, and I would urge our colleagues to do the same. I yield the floor. I suggest the item number 4.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President, I will use leader time to make my speech.
We're in a quorum call, sir.
I ask consent the quorum be terminated.
Without objection?
Mr. President, I'll use my leader time to give my remarks. As soon as I have finished my remarks, I ask consent the vote would go forward at that time.
Without objection?
Mr. President, 2 days ago I came to the floor to talk about the nomination of Goodwin Liu, an extremely well-qualified, fair-minded, and widely respected legal scholar. The President has nominated him to serve his country from the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. All week this body has heard speeches about Mr. Liu's merits, so I'll repeat them only briefly. He was a Rhodes Scholar, clerk in the United States Supreme Court. He served as Associate Dean at the California Berkeley School of Law and is a professor there right now. He's done a lot of pro bono work, even helped launch AmeriCorps. On top of all that, he's lived the American dream. He is a highly successful son of immigrants. His integrity has been praised by Democrats and Republicans, not just one or two, but many. Former Republican Congressman and very conservative Congressman Bob Barr commended Liu's commitment to the Constitution. One of President Bush's former lawyers said Liu falls within the mainstream. Even Ken Starr, the Whitewater special prosecutor, endorsed this man who served in the Clinton administration. The record is clear. Any claims that Goodwin Liu is anything but deserving of our confirmation is simply inaccurate. But I recognize that every senator has the right to vote how he or she feels they should vote. It's worth noting, however, that the vote before us now is not a vote to confirm him. It's a vote on whether he deserves an up or down vote. And there's no question that he does deserve that up or down vote. A simple up or down vote is hardly a controversial request. This is not only my view or the view of my fellow Democrats, it's a view of my Republican friends as well. In a 2004 Law Review article, one of our Republican colleagues, the junior senator from Texas and a longtime member of the Texas Supreme Court, wrote the following, and I quote, "Wasteful and unnecessary delay in the process of selecting judges hurts our justice system and harms all Americans. It is intolerable no matter who occupies the White House and no matter which party is in the majority in the Senate. Filibusters are by far the most virulent form of delay imaginable." End of quote. The junior senator from Texas is in the chamber today. We will see if he still feels that way, or if he will, in his own words, hurt our justice system and harm all Americans with intolerable, virulent delays. We'll carefully be watching how he votes today. We'll also be carefully watching another Republican senator, the senior senator from Tennessee, who said this in 2005, and I quote, "I pledged then and there I will never filibuster any president's judicial nominee, period. I might vote against them, but I will always see they come to a vote." The senior senator from Tennessee is here today. Never is about as unambiguous as it gets. We'll be watching to see if he upholds his public pledge. A third Republican senator, the junior senator from Georgia, said this in 2005, and I quote, "I will vote to support a vote up or down on every nominee, understanding that were I in the minority party on the issues reversed, I would take exactly the same position because this document, our Constitution, does not equivocate." End of quote. The junior senator from Georgia will be voting this afternoon. Now, as he predicted, he is in the minority, and the issue is reversed. We will see if, as he promised, he will take the same position or if he will equivocate. And here's a fourth. 4 years ago, another Republican senator, the senior senator from Utah and former chairman of the Judiciary Committee, said this on this floor, and I quote, "We may not use our role of advise and consent. We may not use our role of advice and consent to undermine the President's authority to appoint judges. It is wrong to use the filibuster to defeat judicial nominees who have majority support, who would be confirmed if only we could vote up or down. That is why I have never voted against cloture on judicial nominations." End of quote. Yet another pledge never to vote against cloture on a judicial nomination. That's four. There are more. That is precisely the vote before us now. We'll be watching to see if the senior senator from Utah follows his own counsel or if he, in his own judgment, undermines the authority of the President of the United States. These pledges were made publicly and plainly. In a court of law, they would be considered pretty clear evidence. It doesn't take a great legal mind of Goodwin Liu to recognize that simple principle. We've heard the promises. Now we'll hear the votes. I ask for the yeas and nays.
Under the previous order, the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Goodwin Liu of California to be United States Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Goodwin Liu of California to be United States Circuit Judge for the Ninth Circuit shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Balkis. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio.
Nervous about what?
Just making sure.
Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Crapo. Mr. DeMint. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin.
Excuse me. Hello?
Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kerry. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Ritter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting Senators voting in the affirmative: Akaka, Begich, Bennett, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown of Ohio, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Conrad, Feinstein, Franken, Hagan, Harkin, Inouye, Johnson of South Dakota, Kerry, Klobuchar, Cole, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murray, Nelson of Florida, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Whitehouse, Wyden. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, DeMint, Enzi, Graham, Grassley, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Kyle, Lee, Lugar, McCain, McConnell, Nelson of Nebraska, Paul, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Sessions, Shelby, Snow, Wicker. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, no. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Webb. Mr. Webb, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, no. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye.
Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Lautenberg. Aye.